2014, my husband and I took our children on a journey of a lifetime. We explored New Zealand for several weeks and then spent a week relaxing and taking in culture in Sydney, Australia. We had a wonderful time there, but while we were in Sydney, I had an odd realization. Once I saw the seductively beautiful harbour of Sydney, the city was real to me in a way that it hadn't been before, when I'd only imagined it and only seen it in photographs or films. I had knowledge about it. I had a good sense of where it was, the appearance of some of its most distinctive landmarks, and an idea of its population and history. But when I visited, I discovered that Sydney is populated by ordinary people living ordinary lives who drive cars, ride buses, play in parks. They can be frustratingly aloof and thoughtless. They can crowd and jostle you. They can be helpful, even on a couple of occasions, overwhelmingly kind. In other words, they were real people, complex and vibrant. They were so much more than the one-dimensional beings I'd imagined before I went there. And their city wasn't a collection of just sights and attractions. It was home. I had had knowledge about Sydney, but that wasn't enough to make it real. Once I added experience, it became very real. I come originally from Sierra Leone, a country in West Africa, bordered by Guinea and Liberia. In 1819, the Royal British Navy established a Navy station in Freetown, and Freetown became the capital of Sierra Leone, which was the first British colony in West Africa. The country was a British colony until 1961. In my youth, Sierra Leone had a series of civil wars and conflicts. I witnessed and experienced some terrible things, but I also have lots of nice memories from my childhood. When I was in my teens, I landed an internship with a local news agency and was then hired on as a reporter. I covered the United Nations Observer Mission to Sierra Leone, and I ended up having to go into hiding and get out of the country in a hurry when the rebel leader, Fodi Sanko, singled me out and expressed his displeasure about some of my reporting. Thankfully, I had relatives in New York who were able to sponsor my relocation. Coming to the US, I had some misconceptions, so it wasn't really an easy transition for me. More about that in a minute.
Okay, so don't answer out loud, but what do you think when you hear of Sierra Leone? It's probably a blank slate, right? What about West Africa? Well, if you're like most Americans, West Africa doesn't register any differently than just Africa. Okay, so what comes to mind when we think about Africa? For a lot of people of my generation, it's malnourished children on a television set, their bellies swollen with parasites, flies climbing over their faces, their emaciated limbs too weak to brush them away, their bodies too dehydrated to make tears even as they cry in agony. For some people, it may be the terror and chaos of a film like Blood Diamond, which took place in Sierra Leone, or The Last King of Scotland, which is set in Uganda, which is a continent away from Sierra Leone in East Africa. Or for younger people, it may be a much more positive, if equally one-dimensional, image of the fictional kingdom of Wakanda. Of course, Africa and Africans are much more than these limiting tropes. It's home to over 1 billion people. It's where they have families, where they stress about tests in school, hope to get ahead and be comfortable, where they fall in love, have accidents, experience joy, and on and on. It's cities, holy sites, houses, schools. It's open spaces and farms. In short, while there are some differences of culture, climate, it's just like Utah. But just like Sydney wasn't real to our family before we visited, Africa is a place that isn't real to most of us here because we just don't have experience of it.
And yet, we have lots of preconceptions. We think
we know what Africa is. Before I moved to London as a teenager and made several friends from West Africa, I had a clear image of Africa in my mind. It's poverty, corruption, violence, and cruelty. Those are the things that colored that image, that it seemed so clear to me, so obvious. I had little sense of the diversity there, and I couldn't imagine that anyone would be happy there. Where did these preconceived notions that I had come from? I had seen things like rankings of countries in terms of corruption, life expectancy, and so on. I'd seen those pictures of children in areas struck by calamitous drought. I'd heard of apartheid. where deplorable inequality was legitimized and defended by government policies. And then with those little bits of knowledge, without realizing I was doing it, I imagined things to fill in the gaps between the bits of information that I had. I've come to realize that this wasn't just because I was especially dumb. It's something we all do, and not just about places, but about people and things too. We all use our imaginations to fill in the gaps between things we know, or think we know. This can contribute to all kinds of misconceptions and preconceived notions that can get in the way of how we see each other. It can contribute to prejudice.
I had some preconceived notions when I came to the US. Goodness. Americans who visited Freetown always seemed to have so much money. This clearly meant that all Americans were wealthy. I'd heard something about the idea of social safety net that exists to some extent or another in Western democracies. Things like Social Security, Medicare, and so on. This must clearly mean that the government just gives money away to everyone, which would be consistent with how many Americans just seem to be made of money. Life must be so easy. Add to my imaginative misconceptions the deliberate deceptions of several people I knew who had direct experience of the US and whom I assumed I could trust to give me accurate information. One colleague of mine, an American journalist, told me that there were no potholes in America. And because life must be so easy in the US, you must be so successful here unless you're just a total loser, right? So some Sierra Leoneans who had become US citizens, not wanting to seem to be losers, perpetrated the myth by ostentatiously displaying luxuries and passing out money whenever they would come to visit. Later, I discovered how they were scrimping and saving in their daily lives in the US so that they could keep up the fiction of an unrealistic degree of success in America. Can you imagine my surprise when I arrived at the airport in New York and was picked up by my aunt? The car was very ordinary. The roads weren't perfectly smooth. Traffic was chaotic. Where were we? Could this really be the US? My preconceived notions went rapidly through a series of fact checks, and it didn't take me long to realize that, as great as this place is, the US isn't heaven.
Obviously, I'm not racist. Whenever you hear someone start this way, obviously they're not racist, you can be pretty sure they're about to talk about some preconceived notions that show some sort of bias. It's very likely that what they're going to say isn't mean-spirited and isn't meant to put anyone down, but is prejudicial. So is it racism? The terms racism and intolerance are very charged. They're basically accusations. So how can we talk about prejudices that aren't conscious, deliberately thought through attempts to hurt someone based on their skin color or background, and instead are something unconscious? The terms microaggression and unconscious bias are showing up with more frequency, but we still don't have great vocabulary for ideas that these words are trying to get at. Here are a couple of examples. Jestina and I were shopping with our two oldest children at a shoe store. I had taken our little boy, and we were shopping in the little boy section, and Jestina had taken our little girl, and they were shopping in the little girl section. Can you guess who got done first? So my son and I went to the cash register to pay. We were the ones that finished first. And I paid with a credit card, and my son and I waited nearby for Jestina and our daughter to finish. When they finished, Jestina approached the cash register, presented a credit card to pay, and was immediately told she'd have to show ID if she wanted to pay with a credit card. She didn't think anything of it, turned over her ID. I, however, immediately noticed a difference in how we'd been treated. The cards we'd used were on the same account, and it was the same cashier, yet nothing was said to me about needing to show ID. Within a few weeks of this experience, Jestina and I discovered that we were being treated differently at our bank. Jestina wasn't allowed to deposit checks in the drive-thru, and yet I always was. We tested this together around half a dozen times over the next couple of months. Sure enough, to my surprise, whenever Jestina was driving, she would be instructed to come into the branch to deposit the check, and to her surprise, I never had any problem depositing checks in the drive-thru. We were depositing to our joint account in each case. I certainly hope that the shoe store and the bank didn't actually have discriminatory policies, meaning that how Jestina and I were treated differently was up to the discretion of the employees that were there. So were those employees racists? Calling them racist definitely seems a little too harsh, but these were experiences that certainly felt discriminatory to us. These experiences were almost surely not the result of a thought-out, conscious attitude toward people of a certain appearance or background. They were probably the result of assumptions that were made based on very little information, like the color of Jestina's skin.
I strongly doubt that cashier and those tellers would condone discrimination if they heard of it. This illustrates an interesting problem. We can all identify bias in others, and it's easy to condemn them. But it's harder to be aware of our own bias preconceptions. Was it discriminatory of me to think that Americans were all rich? When I married Paul, and then about a year later we decided to move to Utah, a friend of mine was deeply concerned. She had seen a true crime show about a white guy who married a black woman and then isolated her and ended up killing her. My friend was worried that the same might happen to me. That shows my friend's bias. Why would she think that Paul would do that to me? Because he's a white guy? Well, she had a little bit of information and she had heard an anecdote. And she knew that Paul was white. And then she imagined the rest. Bias often comes from an unfortunate combination of a little bit of information and a whole lot of unintentional imagination.
Maybe the bank and the shoe store employees had heard anecdotes about a black woman who was fraudulently depositing checks and using other people's credit cards. Maybe that's why they were treating Jestina differently.
I have a gut level reaction when I see a big white guy with lots of tattoos. I'm scared. I've seen pictures of people who are in white supremacist gangs, and that's my mental picture of them.
We have a friend who adopted a black child who recently said, well, obviously I'm not racist, and then proceeded to tell us how she felt she had to engage in evasive maneuvers at the mall when she saw a couple of black teenagers who were, quote, obviously gangbangers. We asked her a bit more. She knew nothing about them other than the color of their skin and their fashion sensibility. Obviously gangbangers?
We all have biases. If anyone thinks they don't, they probably could raise their consciousness a notch or two. I guess that's the point. We all could.
Realizing that we all have prejudices, that we all have preconceived notions about people, places, or things, doesn't mean we're bad, but it also doesn't mean it's just okay to let our prejudices rule us. And it certainly doesn't make it okay to treat people differently based on our biases. We should seek out our biases and seek to move past them.
Sometimes people ask if I've encountered racism in Utah. I have experienced blatant, hateful racism. For instance, one time a big white guy with tattoos screamed the N-word at me repeatedly on the sidewalk in front of my kids' school while I was picking them up. But that's really, really unusual. Sometimes people ask me if there is more racism here than in New York. That's hard to answer because I haven't carried out any studies to measure racism in either place. But my experience is that New Yorkers are much more entrenched in their biases and much more likely to feel justified in them, whereas people here usually are pretty unaware that they do have biases.
Preconceived notions aren't just about race either. A friend of Jestina in New York dated a black guy from Jamaica for a while, and he had some very surprising misconceptions about the life Jestina must have lived before moving to New York.
He seriously asked me how it was like to live in a house. He thought that I'd live in a tree, and he also asked what it was like to wear clothes.
Sounds like a photo montage from an old National Geographic.
So what is the point here? We've talked about the fact that we all have preconceived notions and how these preconceived notions can contribute to bias, whether we're aware of it or not. What do we make of all of this?
First of all, we can simply be more careful in the way we think about people. What do we actually know? Usually not as much as we think. We fill in a lot with our imagination and our assumptions. But how do we get past the misconceptions that result?
The best way is to just get to know people from different backgrounds. Talk to people, say hello in the grocery store line or while waiting for a parent meeting to start. It can also be an effective way to look for structured ways to serve other people, like volunteering with humanitarian organizations that help refugees or recent immigrants to serve a different population from what we know and have experience with.
Why should we bother? Why is it worth the energy, the time, the effort? Our family has rich memories of the places we visited on our trip to New Zealand and Australia. We had experiences that gave color and life to the bits of knowledge we had about that part of the world before we went. It's the same thing with getting to know people. As we gain more experience with people that come from backgrounds that are different from our own, our understanding will be richer, our human network will be stronger, and our memories will be more beautiful and gratifying.
Before we got married, we were counseled to be careful because we were from such different cultural backgrounds, and we have different expectations about our relationship, about what our relationship should be. This is a good advice, and there certainly have been times when we've had to learn from one another's culture. But there's a more general principle here.
In any relationship, be it marital, business, community, etc., people are coming from different backgrounds, even if they look the same and seem to have the same cultural background. As we practice identifying our own assumptions and preconceptions, as we work to broaden our experiences so that our biases no longer limit us, we learn how to have empathy. And this empathy, which is a skill we can learn and practice, can help us in every interaction, including those where we're dealing with people that look like us.
So smile when you see me at the store. Chat me up in line. Let's get to know each other. We can learn from how the world looks different to you and to me. Maybe you can explain your tattoos to me, and I can see past them to see you. Thank you.